So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a long time in the making. And so I'm going to talk about something, well, I'm going to talk about African maritime history and then how enslaved Africans brought these traditions to the Americas. And I am a historian, so I'm a historian of the African diaspora. I primarily focus on what I call aquatic history. It is maritime history, but I ended up using the term aquatics because for African descended people, it required them to get wet. So boating, fishing, obviously swimming, and surfing, right, requires people to get wet, unlike kind of the tall ships that we oftentimes think of when we think of maritime history. I'm going to show a lot of images for a couple reasons. One, I'm working on an online archive that is most of the historical images that I have been able to find that show African descended people engaging in aquatic activities. And so they can be really helpful. They can also be problematic, which I can talk about. I mean, technically sometimes they're wrong. The image there in the top, I guess your top right, is the only image we have of African surfing. But for the surfers in the room, you might know that, so there's 4 guys right here, but they're lining up to catch a wave and they're going the wrong way. If you know anything about surfing, they're going right when they should be going left. But you will see what I'm going to talk about today is what's known as surf canoeing, which is actually catching waves in canoes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so, yeah, I mean, another thing, I put this image up because it's one of these older historical images. It's from 1602. And it shows a bunch of different things, and there would be letters with corresponding descriptions. And so while it shows things, it's also technically inaccurate. I mean, you wouldn't want to show, you wouldn't want to be in a canoe that small with 2 cows. And then the rigging on this canoe is all wrong. Africans had sailing traditions prior to Europeans, but the artist didn't know, and so it suggests then, and many historians assumed, that Africans learned to sail from Europeans because it's a European-rigged vessel, or it has a European rigging, sorry. So before I get into the talk, I'm going to talk broadly, but I am going to talk a bit about the Fanti, who are part of a larger language culture group called the Akan. Some of you may be familiar with some of the other ethnic groups like the Asante, the Ahanta, the Bauli. And so I'm going to primarily focus on today well, Jim wanted me to talk about a long time ago, and then I think he forgot, the Browns Ferry vessel. And so the reason why I want to talk about surf canoes, which you have a surf canoe here and a traditional canoe there. So surf canoe is basically a canoe here. This is a canoe, and then this part is built up. So there's weatherboards, and then they do actually have ribs and keels on the inside of these surf canoes, which I'll get back to towards the end of my talk. But just to kind of tune you into that. And then I'll also be talking about surf ports. Well, and so Africa, as you can see from the coastline there's not really any natural harbors. So the only way to get from land to shore was to cross through the surf. So Africans invented surf canoeing in order to access fisheries and shipping lanes. So I'll be talking a good bit about that. And then actually let me show this image here. And let me go ahead and get into the talk. The date range on my talk, 1444 to 1888, in case you're not familiar. So while the talk is centered on Africa and African people's experiences, also their interactions with Europeans are really crucial, which I'll get to as I go on. But 1444 is when Europeans, the Portuguese in particular, first sailed into sub-Saharan Africa, and then 1888 is when slavery was finally abolished in the Americas, when Brazil abolished slavery. And so I'm kind of using those, even though that image doesn't show it, kind of bookending it. It might seem like I did that intent, like I kind of made up those dates. They're not. So anyway, and I'm going to read my paper so I stay on time and finish so we have time to talk. So maritime history has long been the stories of men that focus on Western ships and pivot around Western perceptions of that maritime labor was masculine, causing generations of scholars to conclude that Africans do not have a maritime history and that African women did not engage in canoeing and fishing. Africans have thousands of years of maritime history, and women freely engaged in many types of maritime work, with enslaved women in the Americas recreating African gendered labor practices. And so as we get to the end, I'll talk about women in the Americas, especially in this region. So water is a defining geographic feature throughout Atlantic Africa, which stretches from Senegal in the north to Angola in the south, extending inland to the headwaters of the Congo River and the sweeping arch of the Niger River bend. It possesses thousands of miles of coastline, while numerous broad rivers and lakes provide many inland people with shoreline experiences. Atlantic Africans did not merely live along shorelines and riverbanks. They were members of seaward-facing societies that created human shores by actively engaging with rivers and seas to seamlessly merge land and water into waterscapes of social, cultural, and spiritual meaning and belonging. This talk encourages us to engage with beaches and seas from an African vantage point, from shorelines looking seaward, from the hull of a canoe skimming the water's surface, from inside human bodies immersed in liquid infinities. Dugout canoes were Africans' versatile solution for environmental challenges, transforming what would have been watery barriers into places of knowing, meaning, and belonging. Canoes express the conjoining of aquatic and terrestrial experiences. Canoes were omnipresent beach fixtures, part of the built environment. They were more than material objects, they were living entities that expressed generational wisdom and were ingrained with value. Dugouts were companions and collaborators and members of communities of belonging, transporting canoeists safely across seas, returning them home with fish and incomes. Canoe making was a widely held skill, with non-professionals making smaller dugouts, while professionals crafted large, specialized vessels that required expert abilities. Professional canoe making was a sacred craft reflected in the Senegambian proverb on the screen. Most canoes were carved from sacred silk cotton trees, as their timber was resistant to rot and bug infestation. Over 160 feet tall, cottonwood's canopy, branches, and buttress roots connected heavens and earth, while their trunks housed the souls of generations waiting to be born. Beneath their limbs, members of many ethnic groups performed spiritual ceremonies, especially those pertaining to rites of passage, when a child became a woman or a man. The soul of the tree that dugouts were carved from continued to reside in the hull, and canoes had a gender that was determined by the shape of the tree the canoe was carved from or how the canoe rode. Canoeists performed ceremonies to welcome canoes into communities of belonging and formalized symbiotic relationships, with well-treated canoes guiding fisherwomen and men to shoals of fish and telling them when to cast nets. Spiritual motifs carved in high and low relief articulated canoes' relationships with the water and the spirits residing therein, affording guidance for mariners in quest of fish, markets, and safe passages. Water was a sacred and dangerous element, requiring people to respect it. It was generally ascribed with feminine qualities and populated by deities and spirits whose voices were heard in the sound of breaking waves and flowing streams. Many believe the realm of the dead lay at the bottom of or across the river or across the ocean or a large river, lake, or lagoon. For Africans, life was cyclical. One lived, died, and was reborn. Water channeled one's soul across what is commonly called the Kalunga, a liminal, permeable divide between the land of the living and the realm of the dead, where the soul was reunited with ancestral spirits waiting to be reborn. To facilitate this voyage, members of many communities in Africa and the Americas buried the dead with a small canoe. Throughout the Americas, members of many enslaved communities, including the Gullah, positioned the dead so the souls could quickly transmigrate back to African home waterscapes. At low tide, the departed were sometimes buried at the water's edge, so the rising tide enveloped their bodies in its spiritual embrace, expediting their voyages to the ancestral realm. People from Senegal to South Africa and as far inland as Mali believed in deities that are half woman, half fish, with Mamiwata being the most celebrated of these Fin divinities. She safeguarded followers from drowning and rewarded them with enhanced spiritual understanding, good health, and success. By the mid-17th century, enslaved Africans had populated New World waterscapes with Mamiwata and other deities. African bodies, like canoes, possessed spirits and cultural meanings. Sources indicate that many people were strong swimmers, enabling them to intimately understand surface and submarine waters. At a time when most white people could not swim, European travelers were amazed by Africans' expertise. During the 1590s, a Dutchman described the Fanti using the crawl or the breaststroke, writing, quote, "They can swim very fast, easily outdoing people of our nation in swimming and underwater diving," end quote. Africans used swimming in recreational or during the recreational and working lives. While an English explorer was several hundred miles inland, he observed a fisherman dive underwater to set a fish trap. His lung capacity was so great it, quote, "permitted him to remain submerged for such a length of time that I thought he had actually drowned himself," end quote. Ivory merchants in the Congo hid tusk underwater to prevent theft, while another English explorer described this, writing, quote, "It was very curious to see an African dive into the river and fetch up a big tusk from his watery cellar for sale, a task requiring considerable ability since they could weigh in excess of 100 pounds, end quote. Women were also expert swimmers and divers. In Sierra Leone, it was, quote, "celebrated for its excellent rock oysters, which are brought up in quantities by women divers," end quote. Importantly, for South Carolina, the tradition of burning shells to make mortar known as tabby was introduced by people from Sierra Leone who came to be the founding mothers and fathers of the Gullah. Aquatic fluencies express generational wisdom, enabling women and men to enjoy and take pride in their wet bodies. Bodies were gifts from the Creator, while aquatics sculpted them into muscular physiques that were accentuated and consecrated by ritual scarification applied during rites of passage to visibly express ethnic membership. People also ornamented their bodies with strings of sacred beads and amulets, which protected them from harm while engaging in aquatics. Aquatics facilitated then the creation of immersionary cultures. Communicating with spirits was part of daily life, with water being a catalyst for doing so. Submerging one's body in as one swam and bathed permitted individuals to engage with sacred waters, ancestral spirits, and other water deities. Sitting on riverbanks and beaches, Africans listened to the voices of ancestral spirits. Mothers on both sides of the Atlantic taught their children to swim when they were about 2 or 3 years old. After teaching children the fundamentals, parents promoted expertise through play. Beaches became important playgrounds and places of learning. Youth played with the sea, learning about the physics of breakers, and seeing and feeling how the ocean pushed and pulled their bodies as they learned its rhythms. Many Atlantic Africans began learning to surf when about 4 years old, becoming proficient when they were about 7, transforming turbulent surf zones into safe places of play. At Elmina, in what's now Ghana, a Dutch traveler watched, quote, "several hundred boys and girls sporting together before the beach and in many places among the rolling and breaking waves, learning to swim and surf." While swimming and surfing, youth socialized and fabricated group cohesion and aptitudes like leadership, loyalty, and responsibility. Surfing opened seas of possibilities for Atlantic Africans who remain the only people in the world to have ever harnessed wave energy as part of their daily labor practices. Atlantic Africa possesses few natural harbors, requiring people to pass through the surf, as I mentioned earlier, in order to access the ocean. Atlantic Africans used waves to slingshot surf canoes laden with fish or cargo ashore. Surf canoes were upwards of 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. They were fast, nimble, and responsive, capable of catching waves up to 8 feet high while loaded with several tons of cargo. Youth used surfing to develop the sophisticated understandings of wave riding necessary to crew surf canoes. When about 15 years old, males, and to a lesser extent females, began applying youthful surf lessons as they took up surf canoe paddles. Surf canoes were invented about 1,000 years ago and were central to African economies. Importantly, Fanti mariners, like members of other coastal ethnic groups, did not exclusively engage in fishing or commerce, instead engaging in both. Coastal seas were thick with Fanti surf canoes, extending communities seaward. 18th century sources indicate that upwards of 600 surf canoes worked fisheries off Elmina, and similarly another 600 off Cape Coast, which were just a few miles apart from each other. Assumptions about European maritime superiority has seemingly caused scholars to conclude that it was enough for them to cross oceans without considering how Europeans actually reached African beaches and markets. Surf zones, or this space between shore and where waves are created barriers of fear for Europeans, thus remained the realm of surf canoemen, as Western rowboats were too slow to catch waves and regularly capsized in the surf, causing Europeans to conceptualize African spaces of pleasure and profit as a quote-unquote surf-bound coast, where white people drowned or were eaten by sharks. Hence, Westerners remained reliant on surf canoemen for over 400 years. Slave trading records extensively document England's employment of surf canoemen to transport tens of thousands of enslaved Africans to slave ships anchored offshore. Likewise, the American Navy relied heavily upon surf canoemen when it sought to suppress the Atlantic slave trade after 1807, when it was abolished, with one American naval officer writing in 1850 that, quote, "Uncle Sam's boats are not built for beaching. We have to trust ourselves again to big dugouts to bear us through the surf, for which we pay an English shilling or an American quarter." Lacking natural harbors, Africans developed surf ports, which provide the same shipping, receiving, and processing and distribution functions as seaports, but require passages through surf zones. From the 1480s through the 1950s, when seaports were constructed, much of Atlantic Africa's imports and exports passed through surf ports. Surf ports were central to global trade, and their beaches became the wharves of the world. Africans did not pursue massive infrastructure projects like carving beaches into seaports. Instead, they mimicked maritime or marine environments. For centuries, coral has served as a conceptual tool, a metaphor for considering how humans can construct societies that beneficially integrate all members into communities of belonging. Just as tiny coral polyps collaborate to construct extensive reefs that are home to thriving marine communities, surf ports functioned in concert, enabling ocean-facing African states to transform extensive coastlines into economic reefs that fostered economies of scale that long favored Africans during their commercial relationships with Europeans. During the 15th century, the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, earned its name from Fanti fishermen selling gold to Portuguese merchants, and Fanti rulers ended up permitting the Portuguese to build trade forts, which later came to be known as slave castles, in their surf ports. By 1700, the Fanti, who controlled about 110 miles of coastline, had 8 large and some 30 smaller surf ports that were home to 4,000 surf canoes and roughly 75,000 surf canoemen. Slave trading records suggest that many of the 12 million Africans funneled into the Atlantic slave trade were taken from surf ports to slave ships and surf canoes, and over 1.2 million captives were exported from the Gold Coast alone, punctuating their global impact. As trade with European merchants intensified during the 1600s, Africa's human shores increasingly provided coastal peoples with overseas perspectives and intimate understandings of diverse African and Western marketing structures. Let me skip ahead a little bit here. Now, beach surf canoes were meeting places and marketplaces for goods and information of people of diverse African ethnicities, and with the arrival of Europeans, different races. Goods were sold from canoes as maritime techniques were discussed and exchanged on beaches. The female relatives of fishermen and merchants collected and organized goods for sale while discussing market prices. Children played in canoes, the sand, and surf, with all understanding how surf canoes were central to charting an aqueous continent of opportunity, extending as far as one was willing to voyage. African women importantly benefited from relationships with beaches and seas. As previously noted, they processed, marketed, and distributed most of the seafood caught by themselves and by male relatives, which they sold at local markets while collaborating with men to create trade networks extending hundreds of miles inland and thousands of miles along the coast. Women in most ethnic groups formed reciprocal relationships with male relatives who were fishermen that enabled women to generate substantial incomes and could allow women, to organize male maritime labor. Many women reinvested money from marketing into the purchasing of surf canoes and fishing gear, so they regularly owned between 20% and 75% of the vessels in a given surf port. Now this is significant because watercraft the world over are important for both their productivity and as cultural symbols. Surf canoes connected communities to sources of subsistence and capital, making canoe owners important members of communities, as this English official documents here, and I won't read the quote, as you can do so. Now, the Fanti surf canoe paddles further illustrate Africans' abilities to derive solutions for environmental challenges. All surf canoe paddles differ from those used on calm water, as their blades tend to be shorter and broader, and as they're designed for rapid acceleration. Fanti surf canoe paddles, which you can see here, the trident-shaped paddles there, and in these images, they maximize propulsion. So their slightly spread fingers increase the blade's surface area when paddled forward in a rapid motion, but they allow water to pass through if on the forward stroke they accidentally hit the water. So they offer less resistance when bringing the paddle forward in waves if it hits a wave. So you can see these images. I think this is a really good image. I hesitated to use it because the two women here are kind of sexualized. I obscured them, but you can see this man here, a fancy man, holding a surf canoe paddle. I don't know if I'm blocking people's view. But anyway, let me continue on. So the Atlantic slave trade, imposed new meanings onto African beaches, transforming what had been places of pleasure and profit into dehumanizing sites of subjugation. For the 12 million Africans who entered the Atlantic slave trade, beaches were their last glimpse of their home continent. In the sand, slave traders stripped captives nude, shaved the heads of women and men, casting strings of sacred beads into the sand, divesting Africans of the cultural symbols of ethnic and community belonging, relegating them to what sociologists have called social death. African bodies were desecrated as enslavers' calculating touch and branding irons commodified African flesh and marked them with the signs of ownership. Before being taken to awaiting slave ships, some scooped handfuls of sand into their mouths so they might have something to remember Africa by. For many of the 10 million Africans who survived Atlantic crossings, beaches were their first glimpse of the Americas. Here, bodies were again defiled by groping purchasers and branding irons. Even as the slave trade imposed social death, life for Africans remained cyclical. Again, one lived, died, and was reborn. In the Americas, captives were reborn into communities of belonging, inspiring the enslaved to constantly recreate and reimagine their ethnic traditions to bring pleasure and meaning to their exploited lives. Most enslavers built their estates, and you can see this obviously here, along natural waterways to facilitate the shipment of slave-produced cash crops to seaports or ships lying at anchor. Thus, dispossessed Africans found themselves in tropical and semi-tropical waterscapes like those they had been stolen from. Enslavers recognized that Africans' aquatic expertise could be exploited to generate tremendous profits and support the production of cash crops like indigo, rice, tobacco, and cotton, compelling captives to keep traditions alive in the Americas, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that you have enslaved Africans keeping traditions alive for themselves, but then also slave trade or slave owners were forcing Africans to keep traditions alive because it made economic sense for them. So skilled underwater divers recovered goods from shipwrecks and harvested pearl oysters. Captives were required to craft African-style dugout canoes, which were used to transport slave-produced cash crops directly to ships lying at anchor in coastal waters to conduct what is called floating trade. In some important ways, this process inhibited the development of seaports in slave trading regions throughout the Americas, including in Georgetown and Charleston. And so it's one of the reasons why, despite Charleston and Georgetown being such important seaports, when you look at them, they're really small, right? There's not huge docks and wharves. And the reason is that enslaved Africans used canoes instead of building wharves, they could just take goods directly to ships, right? And so you have the underdevelopment. If you look at, say, even in the Chesapeake Bay, there's not the massive seaports that you would see if you went to Europe or to the American North. So even as slavery brutalized African minds and bodies, African-born captives infused New World waterscapes with African spiritual beliefs, populating them with African deities, infusing them with familiar customs and practices. And I want to stop for just a second and show this image, which I'm sure many of you have seen, probably most of you have seen. It's oftentimes, it's probably the best colonial image of African traditions in the Americas, probably a precursor of the Gullah tradition. And when we look at it, it's oftentimes used, historians anyway, oftentimes use it to understand kind of land-bound or terrestrial experiences, right? Because this is a cultural, religious ceremony that is taking place on land. But if you look in the background, you can see that there's two beaches. So these people are on a beach, there's a river, and then another enslaved community behind it. And then you can actually see I think it's two canoes on that river, right? And so they are in the low country, and this is a place where water was dominant. And so you wonder, you could speculate, why are these people performing this ceremony where they are? What does the water have to do with it? After working for enslavers for most of their waking hours, captives slipped into rivers and seas to cool off, soothe aching muscles, and wash away the dirt of plantation slavery. After slavery was abolished, Bill Crump, who was enslaved in North Carolina, recalled, quote, "We worked in the fields from sunup to sundown, but had an hour off at dinner time to swim and relax," end quote. The captives end up transforming beaches and riverbanks into human shores where family members and friends who were enslaved on different estates, as Zenobia had talked about, met to socialize in the evening and on weekends. Community members cooked and ate together, played music and danced. Others swam in rivers and seas, enjoying and taking pride in bodies brutalized by slavery. During their free time, captives crafted dugout canoes. In the American South, they used pine, poplar, and bald cypress trees, while silk cottonwood trees were used in the Caribbean. These canoes were used to visit family members separated for sale. They were used to produce seafood, and on Sundays to travel to African spiritual ceremonies held under the limbs of sacred southern cotton trees and cottonwoods in the Caribbean. And I had to include this image. I mean, it's a baptismal scene. I would argue that yes, it's a baptismal scene, but we shouldn't see it as the end of African spiritual practices, and and then that conversion didn't mean abandoning African practices, I should say, and simply adopting Christianity, but you have the blending of the two. And so if you think about this, what I talked about, water, trees, this would have had a sacred meanings for African-born captives. Even as Europeans colonized continents and islands, enslaved Africans transformed waterscapes into places that looked, felt, smelt, and tasted like Africa. African-born captives insinuated their traditions onto seaports, places designed by white colonists and modeled after European cities. Many Europeans and white northerners who traveled to seaports in the American South, Caribbean, and Latin America believed they had arrived in Africa. While approaching seaports, ships were enveloped by fleets of enslaved fishermen in African-style canoes. Entering harbors, voyagers passed enslaved boys and girls swimming like tritons and mermaids in the sea, end quote. While enslaved women in dugout canoes paddled along ships to sell fresh produce, seafood, and other goods to newly arrived passengers. Canoemen paddled white newcomers ashore and offloaded cargo. Upon docks, captives conversed in African languages, and enslaved women sold African-influenced sea dishes, commonly called pepper pot, jambalaya, fufu, and gumbo. So the aromas of Africa wafted over the scene, tempting white people to indulge in African flavors. Much of the colonial American South had a black majority, and in 1737, a Swiss immigrant to South Carolina reflected that the colony's food, material culture, vernacular, and way of life caused it to, quote, look more like a Negro country than a country settled by white people, end quote. Seaports throughout the Americas provided unique opportunities for women to challenge their gendered and racial subjugation. Seaport women collaborated with enslaved women and men residing on plantations in the surrounding countryside to monopolize weekend markets that provided white residents with most of their fresh meat, produce, eggs, and seafood. Setting prices that favored them, women sold goods from stalls and canoes along the waterfront or carried goods upon their heads, singing out to inform potential customers of what they had. While markets primarily contained food, an Englishman noted that women in St. Vincent, quote, sold everything from a needle to an anchor, end quote. Marketing from dugouts along the waterfront strategically located women to paddle out to newly arrived ships to sell goods and to wash passengers and crew members' clothing as they remained confined aboard ship for days or weeks at a time, waiting to clear customs and quarantine. Even as enslaved women provided white seaport residents with most of their food, many complained that female marketers monopolized and manipulated markets, which they did. So they're clearly, they're controlling the production of food, and so they're engaging in price gouging. And here you have an example of somebody complaining about it in the South Carolina Gazette at the eve of the Revolution. Well, it's a man. It's kind of rings like the first Karen. But anyway, even as enslaved women. Which they did. So canoes were community members who conspired with women, enabling them to engage in price gouging by, among other things, concealing desired items in their hull, providing the illusion of perpetual shortages, while enabling women to replenish goods throughout the day. As in Africa, dugouts were a means of production and a mode of conveyance, as well as a family member. Along riversides and seashores, fathers and sons bonded as they carved canoes that mothers, daughters, and sisters paddled to markets. Knowing family members' safety rested on their craftsmanship, compelling them to carefully fabricate balanced vessels that would not capsize, depositing loved ones and their material possessions into the water. Family canoes permitted women to transport hundreds of pounds of goods each weekend, as well as their children, upwards of 10 miles each way to and from market. Drawn together like flocks of migratory birds, people enslaved on numerous estates formed fleets, transforming waterways into human tides. Voyagers socialized with members of waterside plantations, creating a community of communities. Fleets were mobile marketplaces of information that absorbed news, information, and gossip. Voyages were important moments of privacy away from white supervision, enabling vendors to discuss price gouging strategies. Voyages also allowed mothers and daughters to bond as mothers taught children to handle canoes while instructing them in life lessons. Human tides receded in the afternoon as women carried their children, purchases, and the whisperings of the Atlantic world home. While white people caught fleeting glimpses into this hidden world, white people did catch fleeting glimpses into this hidden world. As captives paddled an English traveler across Georgia's Darien River in 1846, he, quote, met a great number of slaves paddling their canoes from Darien, for this was Saturday, when they were allowed a half holiday, and they had gone to sell on their own account their poultry, eggs, and fish, and were bringing back home tobacco, cloth, and other articles of use and for luxury, end quote. Now, importantly, women vendors attended to community members' social well-being. So they're making money, but as they're going home, they're bringing items that enslaved people needed. And so some of enslaved people's most common complaint was that enslavers failed to meet their basic needs in terms of hygiene, clothing, and that the food rations they received, were bland, insufficient, and lacked nutrients. So market women used their earnings to purchase necessities for family members like soap, combs, cooking utensils, food, cloth, clothing, and shoes. They also brought these items home and sold them to community members. Now, I want to end, as Jim instructed me to, with the Browns Ferry vessel. Now, unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, there's no historical records of this vessel, but we can draw from other historical records to understand the relationships that enslaved Africans and white mariners had with it. So large trading vessels like the Browns Ferry vessel were oftentimes called plantation boats. And they were ubiquitous throughout the American South as well as the Caribbean, providing opportunities for enslaved women and men. Let me show another image here of what it might have looked like, an alternate view of what they might have looked like. Although that one, the Browns Ferry one, had a mast, but there's one here, an alternate version. Anyway, so most were built by enslaved canoe makers who made an array of sailing boats and even ships capable of crossing the Atlantic. While planters used these vessels to take guests from the American North and Europe on pleasure cruises, most days of the week they were working vessels. Many were captained and crewed by enslaved men and used to transport cash crops to market. Planters often permitted female marketeers to voyage aboard these vessels that could travel in the Caribbean upwards of 200 miles round trip. Throughout the, so in the American South, watercraft like the Browns Ferry vessel that were not owned by planters were typically captained by white men and crewed by a mix of enslaved and white mariners. Now, importantly, white captains eagerly engaged in black market enterprises with the enslaved by, among other things, encouraging captives to steal plantation goods to sell to them, as Charles Ball, who was enslaved in both Maryland and South Carolina, illustrates. So Ball was born in Calvert County, Maryland, where his African-born father taught him to craft dugout canoes and to fish with a seine. From his, in around 1800, he was sold to a South Carolina planter whose estate was situated along the Congaree River. And Ball's new owner along the Congaree River instructed him or wanted to exploit his maritime skills by appointing him, in Ball's words, to be, quote, the head of a fishing party, end quote, comprised of himself and 3 other enslaved men, quote, for the purpose of supplying trash fish, which at the time were gar, sturgeon, and catfish that would be fed to field hands as a cheap source of protein, as well as shad that would be consumed by his enslaver and then sold at local markets to white customers. So Ball crafted 2 good canoes out of large, he quoted, quote, 2 good canoes from large yellow pines, end quote, and wove a seine. Ball and his companions fished at night, free of direct white supervision, enabling them to engage in all sorts of illicit activities, including eating the shad, which they weren't supposed to. One night, a, quote, passing white keelboat captain, the captain of a vessel like the Browns River, or the Browns Ferry vessel, offered to trade bacon for shad, which the enslaved fishermen did, knowing bacon would make their stolen fish taste even better. As Ball and another fisherman named Nero pushed off from the keelboat, the captain said, quote, he would be downriver again in about 2 weeks, when he would be very glad to buy any goods from us, including cotton, end quote. Knowing his owner would miss the cotton, Ball refused to steal it, but Nero, quote, stole 2 50-pound bags of cotton, end quote, and sold it to the captain for $30 to $40. Historical records, yeah, this was a lot of money then. Now, historical records indicate that low country captives similarly stole barrels of rice, indigo, and other goods from their enslavers and sold them to boat captains. Now, in conclusion, oceans and rivers tell stories through people and societies, expressing how humans perceived, interacted with, and understood their environments. Enslaved Africans carried African beaches and aquatic traditions to the Americas, establishing human shores along the waters of bondage where canoes continued to be community members. Dugouts helped captives provide or restore a sense of humanity and dignity to their lives, with men taking pride in the vessels they crafted, while women found worth in their ability to engage in market activities that made their lives and those of enslaved family members more bearable and enjoyable. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's you can really see it. I mean, there's the kind of the story that has and hasn't been told, the kind of the traditional histories that suggest that power was concentrated at the top, but the enslaved were always finding ways of getting around, those controlling mechanisms. So it's kind of, kind of to your point too, Zenobia. I mean, so there's like this economy that's going on, and there was always a quote unquote loss margin. I mean, even today where things are skimmed, right? And there's acceptable losses. And so, yeah, I mean, the enslaved people are packing barrels, they're shipping these goods. They knew how to open barrels and take some stuff out, and then close the a hogshead of tobacco, which are these huge barrels weighing upwards of 800 pounds. And so, yeah, so there were always ways, and the really efficient way of moving tobacco, like you could roll it over land, but rolling it actually broke the leaves. So they wanted the leaves to be packed and to stay as big as possible. As they're crushed, they lose their value. So really the way of doing it was putting it into canoes. And so it gives all this free time. I mean, when it's being shipped, there's typically no white supervision on these vessels that we're moving things. And that's one of the things that we don't focus on. Like we think about kind of endpoints. So we might think of plantations and we might think of seaports or ships, but how do the two connect? And there's these passages that they're going on that could take days or even weeks, for enslaved canoemen to take this stuff to market. And that gives them opportunities to open it, to sell it along the way, and things like that, or to claim that it fell overboard. I mean, there's instances where they would claim that a barrel of rice or a hogshead of tobacco fell overboard, and that was an acceptable loss, but they probably didn't fall overboard. It probably was, sold to a white boat captain. Very much so. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is like we think of trade, or we might think of trade as being the exchange of goods, but exchange, it's always been about the exchange of ideas and commercial practices, right? Even today, but much so more so then when people were doing, taking one good and trading it to another. And seaports would have been, these maritime labor has always been incredibly diverse, whether you're looking at, in Africa, it was diverse in terms of ethnic groups coming together. In Europe, people of different nationalities. And then globally, it's always been incredibly diverse in terms of race and ethnicity. And so people were constantly exchanging cultural practices and beliefs and everything, yeah. I have. Yeah, so it's still being done. It very much is still being done. And yeah, it's pretty thrilling. It's a cool experience. If you get a chance to go, it's still being done all up and down the coast.
Is it one man or in the canoe?
No, it's several people. So usually it will be, and that's a good question. It's usually an odd number of people. So the canoes now will have outboard motors. And so there will either be somebody at the outboard motor using it for direction or a steering paddle. And then there's also paddlers. So they don't usually use the outboard motor when they're going out and coming in, like in that surf zone, because they waste too much gas. So that's still usually done by paddling. But it's usually between about 5 to 7 people. So the fishermen who are casting the nets and pulling them in and stuff like that, yeah. And I should actually mention, so if you can get a good example, going back to surfing, the 1964 surf movie, Endless Summer, at the beginning it does have, there's problems with the racialized language, but there is a scene where they're at Accra, Ghana, in a surf canoe, and so it shows that in that movie. You can see it on YouTube even. That's a big question going back. So a lot of it comes from segregation. So the segregation of beaches, first starting in the 1880s, and then the segregation of swimming pools. So most swimming pools were gender segregated, believe it or not. Most cities began to build swimming pools in the 1880s as places where people could bathe. So, before there was indoor plumbing or sufficient plumbing, that's where people would go once a week. And so these were massive swimming pools, and they were gender segregated. And then, kind of post World War I, they became racially segregated, and so that's where a lot of it comes into play. And then, kind of the earlier conversation. Yeah, and I was going to show one more image. Because part of it too, I think, is like how we look at things and the assumptions we have. And so this image, it's by a guy named John Gabriel Stedman, who was Scottish. He ends up serving as a mercenary to put down an enslaved rebellion in Suriname, Dutch Suriname, in the 1770s, at the same time as the American Revolution. He ends up marrying an African woman and fathering a child by her. And these are his enslaved people, kind of before he goes through this process kind of changing. But the image shows, I mean, some of these historical images are so rich. I mean, on the one hand, it shows his initials, JGS, John Gabriel Stedman, branded on his captives, but it has ethnic scarification on them, so it shows us that. But when we look at the images like this, we might think, because there's the man in the foreground, that he's the most important person, he's the most productive, right? He has a fish, he has this basket here, he has a fishing net here. But if you look past him, kind of at his wife, you can see kind of how far more productive women were. Because, I mean, so she has a child on her back, as you can see, a child in tow, she's pregnant, so you can see how productive she is in terms of natural reproduction. And then she's also, she's taking care of the family and then spinning cotton into thread while she's carrying goods on her head and smoking a pipe. Well, I mean, as the woman who was sitting right here said, at YMCA. YMCA and Mommy and Me swim classes when I was about 3 months old. And then, so I have been swimming since then. And then my dad grew up in New York and played basketball at UCLA, and he would go play at the beach. And I would sit at the beach and I had like kind of what I would say is a Jimi Hendrix moment, when he plays the guitar, and then I didn't pass out like he did, but I saw somebody get barreled, so then I said, I have to surf. And so that's when a wave goes over you, so you're in a tube riding inside of a wave. Yeah, and so I said, I have to do that. And so I've been in the water ever since. No, and so there probably is none. But the thing that's interesting, so while there probably was no relationship, I mean, there's no evidence that Polynesians arrived in Africa prior to Europeans in 1444, and no evidence that Africans, I mean, there's some evidence that East Africans made it into the Pacific, but not, and that Polynesians could have made it to East Africa, but not to West Africa. But the thing that's interesting, though, is that Polynesians and Africans, I have a friend who's doing a project on looking at how people explore. So, right, like we might think of people exploring like Europeans and Americans, white people exploring, but he's looking at how American Indians and Polynesians got on boats to explore the world. And so there's a lot of evidence. I mean, if you read Herman Melville's Moby Dick, I mean, and you see how diverse that crew is. There were numbers of many Africans who got onto, especially English naval ships, whaling ships, merchant ships, and end up in the Pacific. And likewise, many examples of Hawaiians arriving in the Atlantic. And so it would be fascinating to come up with, if an African arrived in Waikiki, what they would have thought of that, or if a Hawaiian, made it to Africa, what they would have thought. But yeah, there's not really the sources.
But there's structural similarities.
A lot of similarity, yeah, a lot of similarities.